Hi, Eli and Daisy. Welcome to week
Hi.
5 of your current events class. How was your week?
Well, it rushed by really quickly, but it was
Yeah.
fun.
Okay, that's great. So this week we're talking about climate change. And is that something that you had heard about before this week?
Definitely.
Yes, I agree. Definitely. It's a hot subject. It's something that
Did you
should
intend
be
that as a
concerned
joke?
about.
A hot subject?
No, didn't mean that at all.
Okay.
It's something that people should be concerned about because it's affecting everyone. But there are some, it's just a really sad subject, I guess.
It's affecting everyone, but Eli, do you think it's affecting everyone the same way?
Definitely not. Here, we're not affected much. We're still affected some. Like, we've been getting snow when we usually haven't. But in Guatemala, it definitely affects them. A lot.
Yeah.
Like, people can't live there.
Sometimes it's hotter in some places and colder in others, so it's a really
Yeah.
wobbly.
You're talking about the story that I reported from that island in India. And this is a good moment for me to remind people watching the video at home that if they have not seen the introductory video and the materials that were below it and the details, they should go back and watch that introduction and absorb the background materials and then come back and watch this. And as you watch it and you have your own discussion, feel free to pause this video and talk about it with your kids as we talk about it here on screen. So as long as you mention the island of Guatemala, tell me what you thought of that story.
I thought it was very interesting and also very sad that people just couldn't bear to leave the land they'd lived in for so long, and they were just willing to. So right now, if the tide just swept their house, they were willing to die if they to stay in their land.
Daisy, was there something that surprised you about the story or something you learned from that story that you didn't know before?
I think people can be very connected to places. So that really didn't surprise me because, I mean, it's something that probably all of us have a place in the world where we feel at home. So just knowing that your home is probably one day going to be ruined because of other people when you're trying to stop it is really hard, and that might choose to stay.
That's so perceptive of you. You know, something that I remember so vividly from reporting that story, even though I reported it years ago now, is that when you hear that man, Ratul Saha, speaking in a language that we don't understand, even though we don't know the meaning of the words that he's saying, in just the sound of his voice, you can hear the emotion and you can hear how he's feeling, even without understanding the words.
Definitely.
Yeah, I agree.
So that story is about a place where the impact of climate change is being felt today, now, in this moment. Did you think that climate change was mostly something happening in the future? Or did you think that, this is something that is happening right now? Before you heard that story, I mean.
It's definitely something that's happening right now. Honestly, climate change is going to be irreversible very soon if we don't do something to stop it. By the time I'm an adult, it will have gone too far. It's it's momentum. If you don't stop the wheel or at least slow it down after you've given it a big turn, it's going to keep going.
Yeah. Let's take a step back for a minute and talk about what causes climate change. Why is this happening? Do you know what the reason is?
Greenhouse gases.
Yeah, a lot of factories let out gases and fumes, and cars do it too. In fact, we were driving by a road somewhere on vacation and we saw a factory and we thought it was on fire from afar because it was just letting off fire. It was contained, but it really scared me. And I've seen so many places where gray skies and gas, and it really saddening. Because if you know what it is, then I guess it's hard, but it's good to stop it.
Have you ever heard the phrase carbon footprint? Do you know what that means?
Yeah, isn't it the carbon after a year, the carbon you emit?
Well, so I have a carbon footprint, you have a carbon footprint, everybody on the earth has a carbon footprint, which is just another way of saying how much carbon are you using? How much are you putting out into the world? So if I fly to visit you, and I fly from Washington, D.C. to Seattle, that flight puts some carbon into the world, and that'll contribute to climate change. And if I drive my car to work every day, that uses some carbon. And if I am eating asparagus in winter that was flown in from South America because it was grown where it was warm, well, then that asparagus has a carbon footprint. And for me, eating it has a carbon footprint. Or if I'm eating beef, which produces a lot more carbon to raise instead of eating vegetables, that beef has a bigger carbon footprint than the vegetables do. So does that make sense? Do you understand carbon footprint?
Yeah.
So people with a bigger carbon footprint are contributing more to climate change, and people with a smaller carbon footprint are contributing less to climate change. Which brings us back to that question I asked towards the beginning about, does climate change affect different people differently? And this is one of the sort of surprising, unexpected, sad things about who it affects. When you think about the stories that you listened to about Paris and the Marshall Islands and India, do those people who are being most affected by climate change today have a big carbon footprint or a small carbon footprint?
I would say they have a small carbon footprint, but...
That's right, because they don't drive cars, and they might not even have refrigerators, and they pretty much stay where they were raised instead of flying all over the world a lot. They have a small carbon footprint.
But the land they're on is different. The land they're on is affected by it, which doesn't necessarily mean it has a carbon footprint.
That's exactly right. So there's this kind of sad irony about who is feeling the worst impacts of climate change right now, which is that so many of the people who are feeling it the most have actually done the least to contribute to it themselves, because their carbon footprint is small, but they're feeling the impact of the things that those of us with big carbon footprints have been doing for years. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. What did you think of the story from Paris about Tony DeBroom from the Marshall Islands?
I thought it was really sad that he had lived here for such a long time, and he's going to have to leave. He's going to have to tell his grandchildren, you can't stay here, you have to go, if we don't do something to stop it. And 2 Celsius isn't that much.
Yeah.
If it was like 10 Celsius, we would have a bit more time, probably a lot more time, but
yeah.
2 Celsius, that really limits things.
Yeah, tell me what you understood about the difference between this debate over 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius. How did you understand that?
I understood it that if it was 2 degrees Celsius, there was no hope for the Marshall Islands. If it was just under 2 degrees Celsius, there might be something left to save.
Yeah, Daisy, tell me what you understood about it. That's exactly right, Eli. How did you understand it, Daisy?
I think I agree with Eli, and I understood it the same way.
Yeah. What did you think about the story from the Paris Climate Summit?
I thought it was, well, like, it's kind of sad when you get to know someone and then know that their life is in danger.
Mm-hmm.
So, or they passed away. So it was really sad to know all of these happy people who were living a normal life, but they were threatened by this giant poster in their city hall saying, like, 2 degrees, we will survive the 2 degrees below. And if they didn't, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, that's all absolutely right. But there was also something really hopeful to come out of that summit. Can you think of what the hopeful thing to come out of that summit was? It wasn't necessarily in the story. I don't know if maybe you heard about it or not.
Well, I can tell one thing hopeful about it is that there actually is a summit. Like, there actually gathering to do something. If there wasn't a summit, there would be like, what can we do? No world leaders are gathering. We'll just have to do our best and delay it.
Well, and at the end of that summit, one of the things that was really surprising and exciting to see is that every country in the world, like almost 200 countries, agreed to the statement of principles, to the goals. I mean, it's hard to think of anything that the whole world would agree on, right?
Yeah.
But they all agreed that it was a problem and that they were going to try to work to solving it. And that debate over whether it was 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, do you know what they decided?
2 degrees?
They decided they would commit to 2 degrees with a goal of putting enough measures in place that it would be 1.5 degrees temperature increase. So that happened almost 5 years ago. And then comes the bad news. Do you want to know what the bad news is?
They haven't really done anything.
You guessed it. These countries all agreed that they would take these steps, but they haven't really met their commitments. And then President Trump said he didn't like other countries telling the United States what to do, and so he was going to pull out of the Paris Climate Summit. And he said the United States would do what it wanted to do. And there are still a lot of companies based in the United States and their states in the US that are taking steps to limit carbon emissions, but the United States has pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. We got some questions from people who were taking these lessons on Twitter. Do you want to share some of the questions that came in?
The first one is from Logan, age 13, and they asked, how quickly is the global temperature rising, and how much are the sea levels rising?
Those are great questions. Now, because this is a current events class instead of a science class, I don't have the deep scientific knowledge, but I did a little research. And in terms of how fast temperatures are rising, each of the last 3 decades, so that means the 1990s, the 2000s, and the 2010s, each of those decades was the hottest decade of the modern era. Does that make sense to you? Do you understand what that means?
Yeah.
Yeah. And in terms of how fast sea levels are rising, scientists say that sea levels have gone up about 7 inches since the year 1900. But, and here's where it gets tricky, the seas are not rising at the same rate in different places because the ocean is huge and complex. And in some parts of the world, water is rising much higher than in other parts of the world. So just to take the example of the United States, on the East Coast, sea levels are rising faster than on the West Coast. And scientists don't totally understand why that is, but that means the city of Miami might be partially underwater 50 years from now, and the city of Seattle, where you live, might not be, because in some places, the water is moving faster and raising higher than in other places. And you know, one of the things that I realized as I was thinking about the links I sent you is that all 3 of those links were about water. But climate change, of course, has to do with more than water. Can you list some of the other impacts that it has?
Heat, cold, well, weather. I think it might encourage like hurricanes because they come from the sea, but I'm not a scientist and I just like made that up on the spot, so I might be wrong.
No, you're exactly right, because warmer seas give more heat and energy to storms that form at sea. And so you have stronger storms getting energy from the warmer seas, and that brings hurricanes ashore with more force. And then if you've got waters that are already a little bit higher and you have more force pushing the water onto the land, you get much bigger floods when those hurricanes come ashore. Those are all correct answers. Those are all exactly right. Eli, can you name any other things that climate change does?
Those were all the ones I could list off the top of my head too. I'm probably missing a couple.
Well, you mentioned heat, and do you know what drought is?
What?
Do you know what drought is? Have you heard the word drought?
Oh yeah, drought. Yeah, it's when there's no water, no rain.
Yeah.
Like water is scarce.
Yeah. And so places are seeing longer and harsher droughts. And then if you've got a forest where there hasn't been rain for seasons or months or years, what happens if there's a little forest fire?
Well, when there's a forest fire and there hasn't been rain, the forest gets really dry, so it's easier for the fire to burn and easier for the fire to spread.
Yeah.
So
easier for the fire to
less up. So even if there's like not a fire in a while, when there is a fire, it's bad, and that's what's good about like nourished green forests.
Yeah. That happened in Australia over their summer, our winter. And it was some of the biggest forest fires the world had ever seen, recently anyway, sweeping across Australia. And you could even see images of the black smoke from space. And, you know, a couple of years ago, there were also big forest fires in California. I don't know if you heard about those. But that's another thing that, you know, it's hard to say climate change caused this and climate change caused that, because there are so many factors that go into any individual thing. But scientists can say climate change will make intense forest fires more common and intense hurricanes more common. So you can't say, oh, well, that hurricane was because of climate change. But you can say that because of climate change, big storms are going to become more common and more intense. What questions did you have about the reading materials? I should say listening materials, the background materials.
Should we read the other people's questions first, or should we do ours?
Sure. Why don't we read one other question that came in through Twitter, and then we can get some of your questions.
Okay. Well, there were two questions that were kind of the same. They were, and I think we can answer them at the same time. And they were, how is climate change impacting animals? From Flynn, age 9, and 3-year-old Alessia asked, what happens to the animals when it gets hotter?
Yeah. Well, animals is a really big category, right? Animals is everything from insects to polar bears to whales to tiny little crustaceans crawling on the bottom of the ocean floor, right?
Yeah.
And just like people are being affected in different ways in different parts of the world, animals are being affected in different ways in different parts of the world. So there are some beetles that used to only be able to live in a teeny tiny slice of the country they live in because of the climate, because that was the only place where the temperatures were good for those beetles. But now, as the climate warms and changes, those beetles are able to spread all over the place. And then there are animals like polar bears, where have you heard what climate change is doing to the polar bears?
Polar bears can't find glaciers anymore. These polar bears just swim and swim, and they just don't have anywhere to go.
Because the icebergs are melting.
Right, so they use the sea ice to hunt for seals. And when there's no ice, it's hard for them to hunt and find food. So a lot of animals are being negatively affected by climate change. Some animals are being positively affected by climate change. But there are also, do you know what an extinction is?
Extinction is when there's
extinct.
What?
Do you know what it means for an animal to go extinct?
Yeah, extinction is when there's no animal left of a species.
Exactly. So Daisy, give me an example of an animal that's extinct.
Okay, now I forget the name. Oh, dodo bird.
A dodo bird. That's a great example. Or if you go to the Natural History Museum here in Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian Museum, which I think you've been to before, you see big fossilized skeletons of what?
Dinosaurs.
Perfect example of an animal that's extinct. Trick question. Is a unicorn extinct?
Oh, well, no.
Because it hasn't.
Technically,
some people believe in unicorns. That's perfectly fine.
Good answer. But technically, scientifically speaking, unicorns are not extinct because technically, scientifically, they never existed.
But they can exist in some people's minds. Just gonna point that out.
So why are we talking about extinctions when we talk about climate change?
Because some animals might be in danger due to climate change, like polar bears and other animals.
Yeah, animals are going extinct really quickly. And just in the natural cycle, animals are always sometimes going extinct. And that's part of the natural system. But it's happening more often now. And that's not all because of climate change. Some of it is because forests are being chopped down to build cities or farms, and some of it is for other reasons, but climate change is contributing to it too. So climate change is having a big impact on all kinds of animals, but the impact is different depending on what kind of animal you're talking about. So what questions did the two of you have?
I had a question, which was, at this rate, how long will it take to rise 2 Celsius with no efforts taken at all?
Wow, you know, it's a great question, but I don't know the answer to that question. I could probably look it up, but I don't have it at my fingertips. But, you know, I'll tell you something about that 2 degrees measurement, right? 2 degrees warming is a really important line that people have drawn and said, it's really important that we not get above this. But if we do get above 2 degrees, then it's going to be even more important that we not get above 4 degrees. And it's going to be even more important that we not get above 6 degrees. And it's not something that we just like run a race and then the race is over and maybe we made it or maybe we didn't. This is something that humans are going to have to deal with one way or another sooner or later. And if we don't deal with it now, things might get bad. And if we don't deal with it later, things might get worse. And if we don't deal with it even after that, things are going to get much worse. So 2 degrees is a really important line. But if we don't make the 2 degrees line, we don't just get to give up and say, oh, well, we didn't make it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Daisy, what questions do you have?
My second question is, my first question was kind of broad, so I'll choose my second question is the island they're living on now in danger? And that's for the
Gormora?
Yes.
Yeah, you mean the islanders who moved from Gormara to the other island, and I forget the name of the other island.
Yeah, it's not. It's like on the tip of my nose, yeah.
Yeah, so because they chose that island because it's higher above sea level and because it's bigger so you can live inland farther away from the sea and the water. The problem is for these people who for generations have lived right on the water and, you know, stayed alive by fishing and their whole life has been on boats, now they're on land in the middle of an island where maybe climate change won't take away their houses, but they have to find a new way to live.
And I had another add-on question with that, and it was, is Gormara sunk already, or?
No, it's still there. And the thing is, it's not like every day a certain amount leaves. It's like every now and then there will be a big storm and the storm will come and pull away some of the edges of the island. And then things will be fine and peaceful for a while. And then there will be another big storm and a flood and somebody's house will be washed away and things will be fine and peaceful for a while. So it's not like this steady creep. It's like this, you know? Did you see the photos from that island in the story?
Yeah, that was quite something to see.
Yeah, yeah. And I also wanted to include a story about the United States because it's easy to think of climate change as something that's affecting people far off in the world. But what did you think of the story about that town that's not far from where I am now, that town in Maryland?
I thought that was very, very sad because it's practically just like Vermont. People have lived there for so long. They didn't want to give up anywhere in Central Street or whatever.
Yeah.
The name of the street. Yeah.
It was sad, but did it also give you hope that people were taking the initiative and making changes to adapt to the world changing around them?
Yeah, and we really need to. Because if we just let it go.
Yeah, Daisy, what did you think of that story?
I think it's something that might be really frightening, especially for the people who live there, who moved there, or who are just like starting out a new life there.
Yeah.
They might not be expecting it, and the videos were very like awakening, I guess. Just to see
just the water rising and the cars washing away.
Yeah, that teamwork is amazing. How they work just to save one human life, like risking 4.
Yeah. You want to read some of the other questions that came in on Twitter?
Yeah. The next question is from Lila, age 11, in Columbus, Ohio, and they asked, why do some people still not believe in climate change?
Interesting question. And it makes me think of the very first current events lesson that we did more than a month ago. Do you remember what that lesson was about?
Knowing what to believe.
Yeah. Why do you think that might be relevant to this question?
Because people could just think, oh, it's just something to get attention. The news wants us to read it so they can get more publicity. I'm not going to listen to it. Or they could just not want to believe it.
Daisy, what do you think? I mean, that's exactly right, Eli, but yeah, Daisy, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree. Not wanting to believe it, denial is like a very, I guess, interesting, powerful, stage.
Yeah. There's a lot of information out there, and there's good information and there's bad information. And it can be really hard to tell the difference between good information and bad information. And it can be very easy to be seduced by information that isn't true or real and believe something that isn't true or real. And there's something else that I think might be a factor at play, which kind of ties into a point that I wanted to discuss before we wrap up, which is what kinds of steps can we take to make a difference? And I should say, like, the reason I mention this now is that, like, some of these steps are challenging, and some of these steps are not easy, and they might not be pleasant. And maybe one reason people don't want to think about climate change is that they don't want to think about the kinds of things they're doing that contribute to climate change, and they don't want to make changes to their life because their life is comfortable. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, so what kinds of things do you think we can do?
Not use as much stuff. We can reuse. We can not use that much plastic.
I think something really important is, like, not just stop riding cars, but liking not riding cars. So that way, when you go to work in the mornings, for example, when this is all over, you see your car and your bike, and you choose your bike, or you choose to walk. And that's something that's really powerful that I think would help.
The ability to choose.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because if you have this car, this place to like zip you there easy, or you have this thing where you can get fresh air and nature, like getting to like the option that will help in the long run.
Not just being like, oh, okay, I'll go biking, and being like actually enjoying it, because then you could be like, someone offers you on a car ride, and if you actually like walking, you'll be like, no, I can walk.
Yeah. So not using cars and airplanes quite as much, and just using less stuff, because stuff has a carbon footprint, and the less stuff we use, the less carbon we're responsible for.
Produced in factories, and factories give off smoke.
Eating less meat actually makes a difference, because meat has you think about the amount of corn that you can eat and the amount of corn that it takes to feed a cow that you're going to eat. It takes a lot of carbon to produce enough corn to feed a cow, and then the cow produces carbon, and then you eat the cow. Well, if you just eat the corn instead, it has a much smaller carbon footprint.
And also, cows give off gas, which is like methane, or a lot of sciencey stuff, and it's harmful to the earth.
Yeah.
So and then one other thing to help with climate change is, this might not be climate change, but to live in like a building or an apartment because it takes up less ground. I might be completely wrong on this, but instead of living on like one house, living in an apartment like destroys less ground. That might be a completely different subject.
Well, what you might be talking about is tree cover and having trees instead of houses and roads and buildings.
Probably.
Because do you know what trees do?
They give us the things
Oxygen.
we breathe.
They
convert
actually
carbon dioxide
they absorb carbon.
Oxygen.
They absorb carbon and they put out oxygen. And so planting trees creates something that takes carbon out of the air, and chopping down forests makes the opposite happen, puts more carbon into the air, or eliminates organisms that are taking carbon out of the air.
I think there was one more question. You want me to read it?
Yeah, sure,
So,
go for it.
6-year-old B lives in a ski resort town, and he asks, will climate change make it so I can't go skiing anymore?
That points to an important distinction between climate and weather. Do you know what the difference is between climate and weather?
Climate is a very large area, and weather is a smaller area, correct?
Pretty close. Weather is, it's cold today, and climate is, the Earth is gradually getting warmer. And even as the Earth gradually gets warmer, there will be days that are very cold. And even as, the Earth has more droughts, there will be places that have a lot of rain. And so in individual places at individual times, there might be things that don't follow the big picture pattern. Does that make sense? And so the answer to the question, will I be able to ski anymore because of climate change? What do you think?
It kind of depends. Sometimes you might be able to ski, and sometimes you might not be able to ski. And
Yeah.
it depends on really what we do.
Yeah, and it's hard to say. Sorry, go ahead.
If a town right next to you produces a lot of emissions, the emissions could weaken the atmosphere, and there could be more climate change where you are, and you could never be able to go skiing again.
You know what? You're raising a point that I think is really important to clarify, which is emissions from the United States don't stay in the United States. And emissions from China don't stay in China. And the reason the island of Goramara in India is sinking is not because India produced a lot of carbon. It's because the world produced a lot of carbon. And so this is a global problem that requires everybody to participate, and it requires global solutions. So it's not just about you and me deciding to ride a bike or eat less meat. It's also about huge systems of industries and countries all over the world figuring out how they're going to move into the future in a way that is responsible and aware of the impact that their decisions are going to have. So to answer the question, it's really hard to say you will or will not be able to ski in this or that town, but we can say that there will probably be less snow in the big picture over years and years and years, but one year might be snowier and one place might be snowier. And so it might not look like, oh, the snow is gone. But as you live a long time, you might say, oh yeah, I remember I used to go trick-or-treating and have to wear a winter coat. And now when I go trick-or-treating, I just have to wear a light jacket over decades of living on this earth. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did the two of you have any other questions about climate change or about the background materials?
Not any that haven't already been answered, really. No.
Yeah. So how are you feeling about all this? What do you think about the situation that the world is in right now?
I think we need to do something, or we're not going to have a future. And we can't just be like, and the next generation can deal with it. Everybody is going to have to deal with it.
I think that's really well said. Daisy, what do you think?
Yeah, Eli says things that are very well said, so I guess
You
we'll
do
leave
too.
it with.
You both do. Daisy, how are you feeling about the situation the world is in?
I guess it's something or another thing that we'll just have to get through.
You know, one thing that I would encourage you both to think about is that we're very lucky to live in a house that's warm and dry, and that we have high-tech computers that allow us to connect to each other. And if we're hungry, we can go to a grocery store and get food. And the people who are being most affected by climate change today are people who are much less lucky and have much less of a cushion to take care of them. And they're being affected by the decisions that all of us in America are making, these people all over the world. And so we're all so connected that I think sometimes it's easy for us to get caught up in our own experience and think of what's happening in my house, in my town, in my state, in my country. But thinking about climate change maybe helps us think of the world as one place that is all connected, because this is a problem that affects everyone and is created by people all over the world.
Definitely.
Okay, so Daisy, how are you feeling?
Good. Well, bad about climate change,
But I would rather you walk away from this not with a sense of despair, but with a sense of hope and purpose that this is something that is within our control and within our power, and that there are things that we can do to shape the future.
yeah, and sometimes a lot more things than the other people that are being affected.
Exactly. Yeah, you and I have more power to do things to change the course of this than the people in Guatemala, who, you remember, had not even heard of climate change.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. It's been great talking with you. Congratulations on making it through another week of Shapiro School. Your final exam is coming up. No, I'm just kidding. You don't have a final exam.
Phew.
All right. I'll see you next week.
Bye.